Everyone. I hope everyone's enjoying their lunch. We have arrived at the penultimate panel at TPI Aspen 2025. I'm Mike Swift. I co-lead the AI news service at MLEX Market Insight. And in the content moderation last night, Steve Del Bianco had a great metaphor where he described covering litigation and tech policy like that it moves at a glacial pace. And in covering tech policy and litigation, often I've felt that way, that I'm tracking 100 glaciers that move very, very slowly until something very dramatic happens. But AI is not like that. I think none of us who were sitting in this room a year ago, even if we could have predicted the results of the presidential election, would have expected that there would have been such a dramatic, quick swing on AI policy away from focus on things like safety and bias and international cooperation to focusing much more on commercial interests and international economic competition and anchoring AI policy to national security concerns. As all of us know in this room, the US, in terms of tech policy, is not Vegas. What happens in the US does not stay here. It reverberates globally. And that's really the purpose of our panel today, to try and look at how things like the Trump AI Action Plan are resonating around the world in the relationship between the US, Europe, and China, and between the federal government and the states. So I think this is going to be a great discussion. Just a quick housekeeping thing. Scott has generously granted us a few minutes to go over, but we are going to be sticking pretty closely to time. I'll be allowing 10 minutes at the end for your questions. But let's jump right into it, and I can introduce the panel. To my left is Victoria Jeffries, who is Director of AI Policy for Meta Platforms. She's also worked at Univision, Netflix, Wilson Sonsini. She started her career as a regulator in the Bureau of Competition of the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. To her left is Xiaoming Liu. She is the Director of Eurasia Group's Geotechnology practice, where she provides in-depth analysis on key policy issues such as the U.S.-China tech competition, artificial intelligence, and semiconductor supply chains. Matt Peralt, just to the left, is the head of artificial intelligence policy at Andreessen Horowitz, where he oversees the firm's policy strategy on AI and helps portfolio companies navigate the AI policy landscape. He gets a voice in greenlighting some of the ideas that are going to make our GDP grow by 10%, as we heard from Chad Jones yesterday. And finally, to the left is Emmy Probasco. She's a senior fellow at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, where she works on the military applications of artificial intelligence. She's a Rhodes Scholar and a U.S. Navy veteran, where she served as a surface warfare officer, deploying twice to the Indo-Pacific. So we have like an amazing diversity of viewpoints here, and I think that's going to make for a great discussion. So just to jump off into it, AI policy looked very different even 1 year ago from how it looks today, with new approaches being proposed in Washington, state capitals, Europe, and China. Each of you look at AI policy from a very different vantage point. What do you see as the key developments in AI policy over the last 12 months, and what are the implications of that?
Sure, happy to. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. Wow, so much has gone on in the last year. So first, as you rightly noted, Mike, we've had a shift from a focus on safetyism to a focus on how do we get more American AI out there everywhere, at home and abroad. And so part of that has been an embrace of the value of open source, which of course, I have to show my bias here. At Meta, I'm particularly delighted to see that change. I think another major change that we've seen is an avalanche of state bills, state legislation. I think as was mentioned in the last panel and probably throughout the last few days, over 1,000 bills. And I think that's pretty concerning. If we take a step back and take a look at what's happening in the globe, around the globe, what was rightly pointed out is that we're, in the earlier panel, is that we're living a natural experiment right now. We need only look to Europe to understand what happens when you impose the heavy hand of ex-ante economic regulation on innovation and technology markets. And so I think we are at serious risk of repeating the European mistake here at home in the United States with a crazy quilt of laws across the states when you're talking about a technology that is not just national, but in fact, global technology. And so I'm pleased to see the administration put out the AI Action Plan some weeks ago and begin to assert its rightful leadership role. I hope that the federal government will continue with that. And we'll see how things continue to develop in the States.
Maybe I will follow up on what has happened in China's AI world. I think the most important event in the past 12 months was the launch of the DeepSeek open source model. It's a major breakthrough from technological perspective. Before this development took place, China has been arguing we don't really have the large language model technology because US has been blocking the critical component, the AI chips, that this technology is heavily relied on to develop and to be adopted. But DeepSeek has changed that equation dramatically. As a result, I think China's thought about AI and its mindset about AI governance has turned around in a very big way. Only a few weeks ago, I was at the Shanghai World AI Conference where China unveiled its global AI strategy just a few days after US launched its own AI action plan. I think the specific timing is accidental, but China's long-term ambition to position itself as a leader in this space has never really changed. They just see an opportunity to step in to address the AI governance challenges around the world. If you look at China's AI global governance plan, there's a few key points. One of them is that it places a heavy focus on AI safety, as US stepping away from this effort as conveyed by its own action plan. Because this issue, I think, throughout the United Nations dialogue last year, to the extent that they passed a UN resolution on safe and trustworthy AI, that China sees an opportunity that there's global concern on this issue, particularly global south, seems to be left by Trump's AI action plan. China sees an opportunity to fill that power vacuum and step in. And I think that there's also interesting comparison to the US plan, which China also, a good part of Chinese business community has promoting open source as well. Because the reality is that China doesn't have a top-notch closed model. Its best competition to US model are open source. So they have been campaigning open source is best way for safety. But when I talk to the participants who present that view at the conference, I asked you, do you really believe that? And he said, this is opportunistic, maybe next year competitive dynamic will change and my proposal will be changed as well. I thought that's an interesting data point to present on this panel. I will stop there.
Mike, thanks so much for moderating this panel. It's always good to be on a panel when you're a little bit hungry and you're looking at a room of people eating what appears to be a delicious lunch, so please save some guacamole for me. Thank you, Jane, Scott, for organizing yet another wonderful event. This is an event that's always special, not just because of the substantive discussions, but because I think what TPI is really aiming to do here is create a community of people who think deeply about these issues. It's been a forum for me for that for a long period of time as I've worn various different hats, and I hope to continue to be a guest here in the future. So I was talking to a reporter a couple weeks ago who referred to our current AI moment using a sailing analogy. Maybe some of the people in the room will understand that better than I do. I'm not a sailor, but it seemed like sort of the right one to me. He said, we're currently luffing. And what I understand luffing to be is that you are, when you have the wind at a certain position on a sailboat, your hair is blowing in the breeze. Maybe if you had different hair than I do, you would really be blowing in the breeze. And you're flying along, and then all of a sudden the direction of the wind changes, and the boat stops, and the sail is sort of going like this, and you're not really moving forward. And I think we're sort of in that moment right now, because if we were here a year ago and we were talking about what we anticipated seeing in AI policy, we would say Colorado has enacted a nation-leading AI law. We have a whole series of laws that are going to be introduced at the state level, focused on algorithmic discrimination. We have other bills focused on critical risk and catastrophic harm. And so surely there will be a lot of momentum over the course of the year in AI policy. Where we're sitting here is actually in a position where most of those state bills have failed to pass. Surprisingly to me, I think as of now, none of the algorithmic discrimination bills have passed. 1047 was defeated in California. California's right now got a bunch of stuff on its plate that it's considering, but right now nothing has been enacted. Colorado, as we speak, is reconsidering the bill that it passed with the Attorney General. He didn't mention his remarks the other day, but with the Attorney General being quite critical of the law that had been enacted, looking for significant reform, and the governor as well. The governor was one of the few state governors to support a moratorium on state AI policy, despite the fact that his state had enacted a law. In the federal government, I think, as the other panelists have said, there is more momentum in the AI action plan, but one of the things I think we saw in the wake of the AI moratorium debate was a desire for the federal government to take action, to craft a legislative framework that would set the rules of the road for AI policy, and we haven't yet seen that. So I think we're at this moment of anticipating what is the framework that will work for governing an AI policy in our nation in the year ahead. Our perspective at Andreessen Horowitz is really focused on what is a framework that's going to work for smaller tech companies. So a lot of the companies in our portfolio don't have a head of AI policy, but also don't have a head of policy. Many of them don't have a general counsel. And so for companies like that, the idea of trying to figure out how to comply with really complex compliance burdens is significant. And the way that I think little tech companies look at the nature of compliance is also different. I think there are lots of things, I see lots of proposals now that are described as light touch regulation, and that might be true for some companies, but if you don't have a general counsel, if you don't have a head of policy, if the idea of hiring an outside auditing firm or an outside legal counsel is a expense and a administrative challenge just in terms of managing that relationship for you, those kinds of compliance burdens are daunting. So I think the question then is, well, are we looking for zero? Is the best thing for AI governance for small tech companies to have no regulation? And in our view, that's not the case. So the life cycle of our funds is 10 years, which means that we have a long-term view of a healthy AI market. If the AI market spikes in the next couple of years and then dives because consumers feel like AI products aren't safe or they're not getting a good experience, that's not actually, we don't have an economic incentive to have that world. So is there a mechanism that could protect consumers while also not imposing the kinds of compliance burdens that would really harm competitiveness in the AI market? And for us, we think the answer is focusing on regulating harmful use as opposed to regulating development. One thing that is really, really confusing to me is why it seems to be the case that we are in this position where we think good regulation, safety-oriented regulation, is doing things like requiring impact assessments, requiring companies of all sizes to try to figure out what a consequential decision is, trying to speculate about potential bias in the future and then write reports about it. Why is that what we think is the thing that would protect people, as opposed to strengthening all of the laws that we have that actually protect people, like consumer protection law, civil rights law, antitrust law, and focusing on enforcing those things. Little tech companies are not looking for a pass from existing law, but I think if we focus on how can we actively enforce and make those laws more robust, we will have a universe where little tech can compete at the frontier, and we have a healthier and more competitive AI market.
Well, I want to say thanks also for inviting me to this conference. It's been fantastic, and I love all the different perspectives, especially because I mostly hang out with military folks, and this has been very different, so I appreciate that. I'll take your sailing. I was a sailor. So in addition to luffing, there's a condition when if you're racing in extremely heavy winds, you'll do something where you dump some amount of the wind. You'll catch some peaks, and you'll luff the front part of the sail, because that's the only way to make forward progress and not capsize. So I feel like maybe that's the situation that we're in, where we're in 50-knot winds, and we're trying to make progress down the race course, and trying to figure out what wind to dump and what wind to catch. The great thing about going last on the panel is that I can now just do a little bit of a cleanup and talk more about subjects I'm more familiar with. I think the comments on China and the race dynamics with China, particularly in the context of national security, have been front and center for the national security community. But one of the things that's been interesting is that China's focus on the open source models and its interest in doing lower cost, more accessible. I mean, they're sort of putting out this message that they are the ones that are going to help the little guys. Meanwhile, a lot of the American rhetoric has been more around America first. And I don't disagree necessarily with that rhetoric, but in thinking about how we are trying to get American AI out around the world, the fear in some of the national security communities is that you're looking at potentially as the Huawei moment for AI models, so that you would have these cheap models that get embedded in lots of different places without the benefit of more secure and, frankly, better functioning US models. With that, I think one of the topics that I don't know that I could go super deep on, but I do think it's very interesting to watch is the deal that was made with the Saudis and the UAE in terms of constructing governance where we can get American models and we can get investment in American tech companies out around the world, but also have an amount of a governance mechanism so we can start to address some of the security concerns. Did we mention export controls? Yeah, I don't care. I can't believe we didn't mention export controls. Speaking of tacking with the wind, that is one that's been changing a lot lately. And I think kind of to the narrative at the beginning of what are you more concerned about? Are you more concerned about certain potentially vague national security threats or other safety threats? Or are you more concerned about American innovation and companies? It starts to change the way that you might look at export controls. And I think we've seen that to some extent. Finally, on the more military stuff, the Department of Defense, there was a lot of excitement with the new administration that what you would see was an administration more excited to adopt commercial technology into the Department of Defense. Now, DoD had been working for a long time. There was this thing called Task Force Lima, and it was all about adopting large language models into Department of Defense tasks. I don't think it was tremendously successful, but they were certainly interested. The excitement was that you would see basically some amount of deregulation inside of the DoD's acquisition system so we could more quickly get commercial products. I don't know that we've seen that yet, but that is certainly a hope. The other major change is that a bunch of the AI companies decided to start working with the Department of Defense, which is something we could talk about more, but that was a big change in national security.
Let's come back to that at some point. So there's a lot to unpack there, but one thing, one sort of common denominator I heard was sort of open source, and obviously that's been the path that Meta has decided to go down. Is it important that with the competition from DeepSeek that it's an American open source standard that becomes globalized? And how might we get there if that's important?
Yeah, so I guess I should, this is a good moment to say that I'm a student of international relations and a competition lawyer by training. So that is the lens through which I tend to look at these issues. And so there's no question that there's a global competition underway for AI supremacy. That's now, I think, well understood and recognized in a way that perhaps it was not a year ago. And we need only look at our greatest competitor to understand the strategy there, which is an open source strategy. If you want to have the kind of substrate of AI across the globe be American, you need American open source models. If you would prefer it to be Chinese, then we can stand by and let them take the market. And so I think that absolutely is critical. And it was very nice to see OpenAI take a page out of the open source book and release their first open source model in some time. We've heard from Grok that they are intending to do the same. And so I think that's all good news. I would like to just comment on something that Matt said, which connects up with the open source issue. When it comes to AI regulation, we are largely at this point talking about safety or consumer protection types of regulation. We're not talking about economic regulation because this is a nascent technology with nascent markets that are highly competitive. And some measure of that is also due to open source, I might say. And so I think it's not helpful to be anchoring on the kind of big tech, little tech rhetoric that occupied a lot of our discussions over the last 5 to 7 years. It's a bit of a red herring because consumer protection laws apply to everyone, right? If you are a small producer, you don't get to sell rancid meat. Everyone must, abide by the rules. And so I just wanted to kind of put that as a marker when you hear that. I understand, of course, Matt, you're here to represent your portfolio companies and the like, but I think we shouldn't get distracted by there have been some efforts to impose AI regulation that essentially regulates math, which is sort of a weird idea, compute thresholds and the like. There have been other suggestions around revenue, and that just doesn't make a lot of sense in this space when we're talking, again, about consumer protection and safety regulations.
Matt, you want to reply to that?
Yeah, so we get told so I agree with a lot of that. We get told in a lot of different venues repeatedly by policymakers, don't worry about this, it doesn't apply to you. It only applies to 5 to 10 companies that are building at the frontier. That is a vision of the market that is directly at odds with our philosophy of how the market should look. We want the frontier to be a place that little tech can build aggressively and can compete. We don't want a world where it's just 5 or 10 companies building at the frontier. So I think the world that we prefer is a world with good AI policy, which is probably focused on regulating harmful use. Not because that's just like so great for profits of industry, but because that is really the linchpin of protecting people when the technology is used in a harmful way. I think the question for us is like when we start to see regulatory models that look like they're creating burdens that would be really hard for small tech companies to implement in some form, and we're being told by the regulators, don't worry, this doesn't cover the little people, then the question for us is like, what is the right way to carve out small tech companies if the idea is to exempt them from regulation? And in our view, that's primarily a revenue threshold because once you have some amount of revenue, and you could debate what it looks like, some amount of revenue, that's then the time when you are competing, your product is in the market, and it's appropriate for you to divert some of that revenue to compliance costs. I think that's a suboptimal world. I don't think that's good public policy. I don't think carve-outs are good public policy. We published a blog post on what are thresholds that would carve out little tech, and I sent it around to a bunch of people, including many of the people in this room, and the main piece of feedback I got was, okay, sure, but what if we just did good AI policy to begin with? That's clearly the most desirable path. But I think the question is, ultimately, like if lawmakers are trying to carve out little tech, what is a mechanism to do that?
Well, but I think we've skated right past the core issue, which is that we should all be helping educate policymakers who are generalists and have to deal with all sorts of issues, not the least of which is AI, that it doesn't make sense to carve out entities that are producing technology that compete at the frontier from the very laws that would be designed to protect consumers and markets. So I think that there's a bit of a disconnect there. I agree, we should encourage them to produce good policy, to produce good laws. And if the answer is, well, this would be crushing to this relatively nascent firm that nonetheless has the wherewithal to produce this incredible technology, then the answer is, well, we should take a look at what they're trying to do then, and does it make sense for a firm of any size, and does it actually protect consumers in the way that we're intending or hoping?
One area where we're not luffing, we've gone full about, I think, is on the chip export policy. And maybe we could talk about that for a minute. How the shift between the Biden administration's policy on chip exports compared to the Trump deal on H2O chips. Could
Sure.
you take us through that?
Sure, I can start on that. For Biden, his chip policy is about promoting domestic manufacturing as well as blocking foreign adversaries to critical AI hardware components. That's manifested in the CHIPS Act as well as his expensive approach to export control. One is for the industry, one is a carrot, one is a stick. But Trump is poised to have some different ideas on both fronts. I think on CHIPS Act, he doesn't believe in government handling subsidies to companies or, in his word, blank checks without a return on investment. That's why he's demanding taking 10% stake in Intel for the past few days in exchange for the government investment already allocated by CHIPS Act to the company. And on export control, he also doesn't seem to fully on board with the Biden administration approach. He thinks certain level of exports of AI chips to China is okay. And so he is giving these fresh lessons to NVIDIA to ship more of those H20 that designed for the Chinese market. I think that has a knock-on effects on the rest of the export control policy realm. Other elements of the bureaucracy who has been running this on the same trajectory for 7-8 years have their heads spinning, and they have been putting similar policy on hold because Trump wants to pursue a fight with China in a very friendly fashion matter. They are having second thoughts on that. So on both fronts, I think Trump is holding back both the carrots and the stick.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I mean, everybody's looking at me. I feel like it's a little bit of this. We were talking about this earlier. There's a little bit of a theory of change in that in the Biden administration, and I think if you listen to some of the folks on the NSC and the OSTP, there was this notion that export controls will not stop the Chinese from developing advanced technology, but it might introduce enough of a speed bump to give American applications a little bit of a leg up, and in particular, that was in the national security realm. I think now the theory of change is actually we need to get this stuff out there as fast as possible, and it's a race ahead. So in a lot of export control, they talk about the two sides, where it's either we're going to try and hold the other guy back, or we're going to try and race ahead. And I think the emphasis has shifted onto the how do we race ahead, how do we adopt the technology, and how do we make the environment better for our companies to make this technology even better for national security.
So you mentioned earlier that you thought it was significant that some AI companies are now working directly with the Department of Defense. Tell us why you thought that's important, and maybe we can all weigh in a little bit on how national security concerns are really affecting this whole picture.
So I think it was in December that OpenAI announced it would do contracts with the Department of Defense. Anthropic is doing work with the Department of Defense. They both actually licensed to the DoD for $1, I believe was the financial amount. And I think this is very significant because the DoD no longer has the technical talent inside of itself to do this kind of development, nor do they even necessarily we've had such a brain drain in terms of technical talent that they don't even really know how to grasp a hold of it. So they need to be collaborating with folks that are at the frontier, as well as other companies that are integrating it, like Palantir, to really make it work for national security applications. It's also a little bit of this trend that went from, there's this notion back, Ash Carter, former Secretary of Defense, started the Defense Innovation Unit, and the notion was there was no connectivity between Silicon Valley and the Department of Defense. And so I think we've swung the other way now. We've got much more collaboration. I think it's fundamentally good that we have much smarter, more responsible applications of AI because we have the experts in the room. And I also think that there's a benefit to the experts who come and partner with the department because the problems are really hard. We'll put you in an austere environment. We'll give you small data problems, not big data problems. We have all of our other sorts of issues. So it's been, I think, a really positive development, but it also introduces some challenges because now these companies, especially in the wake of Ukraine, there was a lot of, oh, we're going to go help resist the Russians, which was fantastic. But it then put these companies in positions that they had not previously had to deal with, where they were making, in the case of Starlink, strategic decisions about deterrence, when to turn on and off satellites that they really did not have never had to arbitrate before. And that adds in this new dynamic where consumers are now complaining about how a company does or doesn't get involved with a national security mission. And I think it's an interesting new wrinkle in the way that the government works with companies on national security.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that? I'd like to come back to the states issue because I did some reporting when in the president's budget bill there was a proposal for a 10-year moratorium on state regulation of AI issues. And I spent a lot of time talking to Republican state legislators from red states and was really taken aback by the passion, the anger that they were feeling, that it was their job to protect the welfare of the people of their states, and Congress was sitting on its hands, and they were going to step up and do something about it, and that it was wrong for the federal government to think about preempting that. And so I guess my question is, Victoria, you sort of talked about the threat of kind of what we heard in the last panel on how DMA and some of the other overregulation in Europe is slowing innovation, and the risk of that happening here. But are the states doing anything good? Is there anything positive in what they sort of describe as this kind of laboratory of democracy with AI?
Yeah, so to debunk a myth, I think, that grew up around the federal state AI moratorium, there was very clear language that would have allowed the states to continue to enforce, rightfully so, their consumer protection laws. And so I think there were a lot of politics around what was happening with the federal budget issue that ended up playing out in part through some of these, the AI moratorium issues. But I don't think anyone would say that it's good policy for the states to suddenly not be able to enforce their consumer protection laws. And I think that there are areas that are traditionally within the realm of state prerogative or priority where it could make sense. But when you're talking about fundamentally regulating a technology like AI, it's not a good outcome, I think, for the United States to have multiple potentially contradictory regulatory obligations. And so that's something that giving the federal government a little bit of time and space to develop the right policies, and also for us to figure out what do we actually need. I mean, we have a pretty robust set of tools, both at the federal and the state level, to deal with any number of issues. And so it's not clear to me yet where the gap may be. What are the specific harms that we're seeking to address and that our current laws and regulations across the federal and state governments cannot address? I would like to see more inquiry there before we rush to regulate, which is the bad example, I think, that we have seen, unfortunately, in Europe.
It was the moratorium debate was very odd because it seems so divorced, like from the substance of the proposal, as Victoria is suggesting, but also sort of divorced, I thought, from like the constitutionally assigned roles for the federal government and state government. So like there was one narrative that was like AI involves interstate commerce and therefore only Congress can act. And then there was another narrative, which is actually like very prevalent and seems bizarre to me, which is Congress hasn't acted and therefore states have a duty to act. And the implication there is like states could do whatever they want. Yeah. And it's sort of bizarre because it seems to assume that the role of that Constitution says that Congress and state legislatures have exactly the same responsibility in our federalist system, and that is just not true. And so the position that we've articulated is that the federal government should govern and help create a national AI market. And for some of the issues that we're discussing on this panel, competitiveness with China, for instance, it was very odd for there to be a California strategy and a Texas strategy and a Florida strategy and a New York strategy. That clearly seems to be the domain of the federal government. And then the question is, well, should states do nothing? And states have a really important role to play in regulating harmful use of AI, which, as Victoria and I have emphasized, like, is, we think, a good direction for public policy. There are these roles of joint regulatory authority for the federal government and state governments, like consumer protection law and civil rights law. There are other bodies of law where states really would take the lead, like there's federal criminal law, but the bulk of criminal law is at the state level. So if you're trying to figure out how am I going to be protected from fraudulent activity, for instance, like, really that's a role for states to play. It's really odd to me that states have sort of abdicated that part of their responsibility, and they've focused on this development-oriented regulation that doesn't actually really, I think, align with what their traditional roles are. And that is not, again, we're not in a better position if there is nothing. I think we are in a better position if states take that role really seriously and are actively legislating and enforcing.
And if I could put just some meat on the bone in terms of a concrete example, we have in New York the RAISE Act, which unfortunately seeks to regulate AI technology based on compute, which leads to the very strange outcome that you're potentially regulating some of the advanced US AI labs and their models, but not competitive models from other countries, for instance, and specifically from China. So that seems like kind of a strange outcome, and particularly where you're talking about head-to-head competition among the models and their performance. Presumably, whatever safety concerns or consumer protection concerns may exist for that level of performance should attach regardless of compute involved.
Thanks. Why don't we open it to questions from the audience? Steve?
You have a mic? On July 23rd, during the announcement of the AI Action Plan, Trump goes on All In podcast. And if any of you had to endure that rambling screed, you heard the president say, there's no way we want to force anyone training a model or doing a retrieval to have to be subject to copyright suits and payments. He went on and on about how that would be a significant barrier to development and deployment of AI. But I haven't seen anything in the executive order addressing that, and I'm wondering whether the panel thinks that's something the government can and should address, and whether you've heard that Trump is planning something.
I have just a brief comment on that, which is that I think what the president was essentially putting forth, which I completely agree with, is that if you want American AI, you must allow training. And luckily, in the United States, we have the fair use doctrine. It is working as it should, and it should continue. So I'm not aware of any other movement afoot, but it seems that things are working as they should for the moment.
So I think what is likely happening here is the Congress is waiting to see how things unfold in the courts, and then depending on how things unfold in the courts, Congress would take action. This is an issue that's existential for little tech. Like, the ability to use copyrighted work in training in a way that's fair use is critical for AI companies. There are suggestions, including last night, that like licensing is a viable model. My understanding is it's not a viable model for Meta, maybe it is, but my understanding is it's not a viable model for large companies, and it's really not a viable model for small companies, both for administrative reasons and for cost reasons. There's also a component of the fair use doctrine that we sort of talked around last night that I think is really important, and a lot of the people in this room who are Section 230 experts, and I know there are a shockingly large number of them in this room, will, I think, appreciate this, which is like 230 is a procedural mechanism in a really important way to to enable companies with fewer resources to devote to litigation to exit litigation earlier in the process. So it's not only about a substantive result on the merits at the end of litigation, it's also about a routing mechanism early in litigation. Fair use has that same flaw, I guess, not benefit, flaw, because it is, as we discussed last night, case-by-case adjudication. I think there are lots of benefits of that. That was talked about as a benefit last night. I think that's correct. But also what it means is almost all cases are going to be adjudicated till late in litigation, and that is going to impose significant, I think, barriers to entry, barriers to development for little tech that's going to disadvantage them.
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
Hi, Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast. I'd like to link the AI issue with one that was talked about yesterday, energy, and the need that AI and AI data centers require with energy. A lot more of it, basically. So nuclear energy, making use of various forms of advanced energy, clean energy. China is well known for really moving ahead on a lot of advanced energy, while in the US we're still figuring out what we're doing with that. So I just would care for any of your thoughts on the linkages to the AI race, to the energy race, if there is a race, between the United States and China.
So I think that what we have learned from observing China's approach to AI development is that there are at least two major important inputs. One is energy and another is data. They have completely uncorked both. And so I think that it's fantastic that we are making strides here in the United States to try to remove barriers to an all-of-the-above energy abundance approach. And I think that one of the things that we may be talking about this time next year, perhaps to preview the closing, is do we need federal privacy law? Some changes, something to further kind of unblock, to the extent that we find ourselves blocked, in reasonable and responsible data access and use for training models.
Maybe just for fun, I will push back on the statement that China has unlimited tolerance for energy consumption. They have their own national energy standards. They have their own climate goal they want to achieve. It's maybe a secondary, in the long run, it may be a secondary objective compared to innovation and economic and strategic prosperity. But I think even President Xi Jinping pretty recently recognized that the growth of data center, especially high energy consumption data center, it's a warning sign for the whole economy. They're not going to let the industry grow in a way that doesn't produce as much innovative value in compared to the sacrifice they put into climate goals. I think there's a fine balance there, but I think the general analogy is right. China has a more unified market, and they have plans for energy consumption, whether it's for data center, for large language models, for platform companies, and US is the opposite of that.
So just to close, what are your quick takes on what the next 12 months will bring?
Well, I think the situation in the States will continue to play out, where sort of in the waning months of some of the last state legislatures, but of course the clock resets and we start all over again in January. And I think we should anticipate another significant wave of proposed legislation. I think, this time next year we may be talking about some of these data issues that go well beyond the copyright and fair use fights. And it'll be interesting to see how the technology develops around agentic AI. It's something that I think has a tremendous amount of potential. I personally am very excited to have my own personalized Victoria bot that will do a bunch of domestic and other kind of administrative labor for me. But I think that will raise a number of, luckily for us, a lot of really interesting policy questions and challenges.
I will predict, I think by the end of the year, US and China will they will have a good chance to reach a transactional small trade deal. And that may well have a AI export control component to it. I think that's a near-term positive. But in terms of a whole 12 months outlook, I'm more pessimistic. I think once they solve this small problem, President Trump got the big trip, red carpet treatment in Beijing, bringing a lot of US CEOs along his side to have that celebratory event. The easy part is over, and the hard structural problem will come next. I think next year, this time, we'll probably talk about a more gloomy outlook in terms of how they solve the bigger challenges between the two countries.
So I have 3 questions, and I'll provide some very high-level answers to each. One. Okay, I have one question, I guess. I think the primary question, which is maybe a segue to the next panel, is: do we have a federal framework? And I'm not on the political side of our house. I have no idea what the answer to that is. But substantively, I think it's really important. I think we need leadership from the federal government to govern the development of AI and to protect and to offer some protections for consumers.
I think my hope is that we'll start to see international AI norms around the use of AI in conflict, and that will you'll start to see that influence other areas of the economy. So, for example, in test and evaluation standards and incident reporting at international conflict. That's my hope. My fear is that we're going to see innovative uses of AI by state actors, national actors, by national actors, particularly in the realm of cybersecurity. So to go back to the earlier panel, I think the opportunity is urgent that we address cybersecurity and we use AI for defense before it gets used for offense.
Thank you.
I see the last panel is coming up here, having emerged from the